Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen W. Long. This is The Writing Life, and if you've watched these at all, you know that I really enjoy these interviews. But it's special when the guest is a good friend, as the case is today, and a talented young man. And so, Frank Lisciandro, welcome to The Writing Life.
Thanks, Steve.
You've done a lot. You have a lot of areas that we could talk about. But today we're going to talk about your latest book, and I want to. So it's Jim Morrison is the subject. I wanted to start with what qualifies you uniquely to do this.
Well, nothing really qualified me to do this. It was just my intention to see that all of my friend Jim Morrison's poems.
So that's the ticket. That's what I meant.
Yeah, were published somehow,
Yeah.
and his friends and other friends and family saw this as either an enormous task or something that might not be necessary to do, or hope someone else would do it. And Jim left 30 notebooks full of poems and hundreds of pages, loose pages of writing. I thought, well, you know, I'm a film editor, was a film editor, a film director, and I'm used to putting things together that are scattered. And I didn't work with Jim on his poetry. He did it kind of secretly and by himself, but I was familiar with his poems. And so a dozen years after he died, I started to get the idea that these poems should be put together. Well, it took me a long time to get to the actual putting them together, making a manuscript out of, it wasn't all work, it was other projects in between. But eventually I came up with a manuscript, and I've got the two families that inherited Jim's legacy together, and they found a publisher, and thus the book.
I think I'm right about this. This is kind of a special publisher, isn't it? Is this the British?
No.
Okay.
This is an American publisher.
Okay.
HarperCollins.
Okay.
And there was another book that was based on the same manuscript, my manuscript, that a British publisher by the name of Genesis put out a book of Jim's poetry. And it's different format, and it's a very, very limited edition. I think it's 2,000 copies. And it's a beautiful book. It's more like a work of art than a book.
Yeah. So just to divert from the subject a little bit, I know you're, in addition to filmmaker, you're a photographer, have, I don't know, probably some thousands of applicable photographs. Does either this book or that book have any of those?
Both of them do.
They do?
Yes. And I think the quality of the photographs in the other book is much higher than the quality of photographs in this book, and that book used coated paper and all the expensive techniques of making a really beautiful book. And HarperCollins, the photographs look all right, but they're not to my standard of how I would have liked to see them printed in a book. They didn't use coated paper, for instance. But yes, there are my photographs in both books.
Yeah. Just to kind of set the scene, would you read a little bit from that? And
would you like me to read some of my intro to the book? So
let's start there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think the intro will give people an understanding of how this book came about. So I wrote, the original plan and sustaining concept for this volume was to release all of Jim's finished writings, as well as some that were in progress at the time of his death. At least a third of the material, most of which has never been published, comes directly from more than 30 notebooks and hundreds of loose written pages that have been archived since Jim's death. This book also includes Jim's 3 self-published books. He self-published while he was alive 3 books. They're called The New Creatures, The Lords, and An American Prayer. And also included is the film treatment for Highway, which was a film that I worked on with Jim, and other writings he released during his lifetime. Everything on Jim's handwritten pages was transcribed exactly as he composed them, As the manuscript's editor, I followed two guidelines. The first was not to change anything, to present the material exactly as it exists. The second guideline, and more difficult to adhere to, was to trust the poet. When I found a poem inscrutable, I trusted that the poet knew what he was doing and creating. Along the way, I was forced to abandon my preconceived notions of what a poem should be and understand Jim's poetry for what it was: unconventional, experimental, bold, threatening, often difficult, and for some readers, possibly offensive.
Yeah. Well, you've really touched on some things that I wanted to ask you about. One of them is the handwriting. Simple question, it was legible enough, obviously, that you could do this.
He wrote everything by hand. I don't know whether he had any typing skills at all or whether he just wanted to do it directly to paper. Yes, between me and my wife at the time, Catherine, we were able to decipher all of his handwriting.
Okay.
It was pretty clear once you got the notion of what he was doing.
Sure. And that's a big book. I mean, it's a physically big book. I didn't realize that the 3 other books were in that as well. But you said that you collected all of his work. You're a writer, I'm a writer. Sometimes you think, is this thing I'm working on, will it ever be done? Because there's this iteration and that one, and you must have come across that. Like the beginning of something, oh, he changed this. Did you, and then how did you decide what's the latest and best?
Well, that's a really good question, Steve. And the fact is that Jim wrote and rewrote virtually everything.
Yeah.
And so we would have maybe 5 or 6 examples of a piece. So it was essentially my job to read them and see what he crossed out in one and didn't cross out in another, and do some detective work. And sometimes it was by the notebook, although he never dated any notebooks.
Yeah.
And sometimes it was just by a feeling or a sense that this must be the last one. Look how he improved the language here. Look how he condensed the language, made the imagery in the poem more startling, stronger, with less words.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I felt I was competent to be able to do that. I've read poetry ever since I was a little kid and wrote poetry myself and written books. So I felt I had a handle on that. I could have made some mistakes, and there's probably some mistakes I made that got printed in this book. But for the most part, I think we chose the ones that were the last and best version of each of his pieces.
Yeah. I had a question that you addressed here, and that is, how do you make those decisions without your prejudice? And I don't know that you can.
I don't know whether you can or not, but as I said, one of the guidelines was to accept what he wrote and not bring my judgment into it, whether the poem was inscrutable, and some of them are, or whether it was plain and simple. I just had to go with it and figure out that he knew better than I did what he was writing. And, you know, when we were friends, when we went to college together, you know, I knew he was a better writer than I was. I always thought that writing would be my game. Mm-hmm. But after meeting several very good writers, I sort of gave that notion.
We hate those people that are so good.
Yeah, really. And he had a kind of compulsion about writing poetry. I mean, you don't fill up that many notebooks. He probably lost as many notebooks, left them behind as ended up in his archive. Yeah. So this was a man who would write for hours. Not every day, but you know, he toured with a rock and roll band. And he had rehearsals. He had shows. He was a busy guy, and he died at a very young age.
Sure.
So he must have spent enormous amount of time composing these writings. Yeah. And there's not only poems in here, but there's other writings also.
Yeah. Well, you talked about, I think we've sort of mentioned episodic essays. Is that?
Yeah.
That's in there as well. And these would be what? Reflections on the state of the world, or what?
Well, he was very interested in cinema, so one section is about cinema, the history of cinema, the history of motion pictures as a beginning form, and then the effect it has on our society. And another was about vision, that is vision through the eyes.
Yeah,
not sort of essays that he wrote and published himself. They exist in, we came up with the word episodic, but I like to think of them as just chunks of material that didn't necessarily need to be sewn together.
Okay.
And
so you think his feeling was to present these at some point as they were, not try to knit the pieces?
Well, he did present them as they were because he published them.
Okay.
If you like, I'd read one or two
Please,
of them.
yes.
Yeah. So let me just make sure what pages they are on. Okay, so excuse me, I should have had these marked, but I didn't. Just the page I thought it was. So this is a section called Eyes, and so here's what he says about eyes at one point. Ask anyone what sense he would preserve above all others, most would say sight, forfeiting 1,000,000 eyes in the body for 2 in the skull. Blind, we could live and possibly discover wisdom. Without touch, we would turn into hunks of wood.
Yeah.
So his reflections are about what sight gives us, what we would miss without it.
Right.
It's not a very long essay, it's a half dozen pages. There's another essay, see if I can find it. So this is about film, and but he also talks about shamanism in here because, in a sense, shamanism was a kind of theater that Aboriginal or Native American tribes or tribes from all over the world employed. And he says, the principle of seance is to cure illness. A mood might overtake a people burdened by historical events or dying in a bad landscape. They seek deliverance from doom, death, dread. Seek possession, the visit of gods and powers, a rewinning of the life source from demon possessors. The cure is culled from ecstasy. Cure illness or prevent its visit, revive the sick, and regain stolen soul. In the seance, the shaman led. A sensuous panic deliberately invoked through drugs, chants, dancing, hurls the shaman into a trance. Change voice, convulsive movement, he acts like a madman. These professional hysterics, chosen precisely for their psychotic healing, once were esteemed. They mediated between man and the spirit world. Their mental travels formed the crux of the religious life of the tribe. He goes on to show how these ceremonies were incorporated into filmmaking. And in fact, how films are like a seance in which we're all joined together and willingly and experience these performances.
Right.
Sometimes the shaman is the film director, sometimes it's the writer, most of the times it's the actors or the story. And so this is where his brain was a lot of the time, thinking about subjects that I was into drugs, rock and roll, and girls at the time, but Jim was out there doing other things.
Makes me think of a couple of things. One is, I had never thought of that, but why, what is the appeal of a horror movie? And is there something about that you can experience it, experience the terror maybe, knowing deep down that you're safe? You know, you're a willing participant. You pay your money, you go into the theater, you watch this. I wouldn't. It's not for me, but some people do. And I wonder if there isn't a relationship with what he's talking about.
I think so, and I think it's whether it's romantic comedy
Sure.
or if it's a thriller or if it's a spy movie.
Right.
They bring us into that life.
Yeah.
good films,
Yeah.
absorb us, we're absorbed by them, and we live through that experience.
Sort of cathartic, maybe.
Yeah, cathartic, and that's what the shaman did,
Yeah.
without the big screen.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to say in relation to this, you told me one time that Jim really considered himself above all a poet, even though he was an icon, even though he was a rock and roll star. He looked at himself as a poet. Is that accurate?
Very, very true. And I think the notebooks are full of poems. This book is mostly poetic material. If you like, I can read one of his poems that he read on stage during parts of it anyway, during rock and roll concerts, and then he published this poem, self-published it, of course. It's called An American Prayer. And if we have a few minutes, I can...
Absolutely. Now, before you do that, I think, didn't he publish, in the sense of print, something and leave it on the seats of all of the...
Oh, very good.
Is that?
No,
okay.
That's another one. That's called Ode to L.A. while thinking of Brian Jones, deceased.
Right.
And it's a poem about Brian Jones, who was one of the founders, the originators of the Rolling Stones group.
Yeah.
And the day that Jim found out that he had died of mysterious circumstances in England, Jim sat down and wrote that poem. It's a very powerful poem. It has a lot of symbolism, metaphor, allusions to different things. And it sort of combines Jim's life and Brian Jones' life and Hamlet, all three together in the poem. So I dare not read it because I think people would be confused by it. But if you sit down and read it yourself and read it a couple of times, it's a wonderful poem because it's not only a poem, but it's a puzzle in a way.
Yeah. Well, let's do this one.
Okay. So I'll read the beginning of it, and maybe it'll make people curious, and then I'll read the end of the first part. Do you know the warm progress under the stars? Do you know we exist? Have you forgotten the keys to the kingdom? Have you been born yet, and are you alive? Let's reinvent the gods, all the myths of the ages, celebrate symbols from deep elder forests. Have you forgotten the lessons of the ancient war? We need great golden copulations. So that's the first lines of the poem. It sets up a lot of images, and but I think in the sense he's talking about legend, myth, the Joseph Campbell kind of story. So it's a 5-part poem, and the end of the first part, which is the longest part of the poem, goes like this. They are waiting to take us into the severed garden. To me, excuse me for trying to explain a poem to you that I didn't write, but severed garden, I've come to realize that that's a cemetery. Okay, sure. They are waiting to take us into the severed garden. Do you know how pale and wanton thrillful comes death on a strange hour, unannounced, unplanned for, like a scaring, over-friendly guest you've brought to bed? Death makes angels of us all and gives us wings where we had shoulders smooth as raven's claws. No more money, no more fancy dress. This other kingdom seems by far the best, until its other joy reveals incest and loose obedience to a vegetable law. I will not go. Prefer a feast of friends to the giant family. And Feast of Friends is the title of one of your books, isn't it? Yeah. Obviously taken from this. Do you know how old Jim was when he wrote that? Early 20s, I imagine. He died at the age of 27, so I imagine he must have been about 24 when he wrote this. But if you give me a minute, I'll read you a poem he wrote when he was 14. Oh gosh, yes. So this is called Horse Latitudes. And Horse Latitudes, as we all know, was a part of the ocean that would go dead silent sometimes. And this is based on the time when there were sailing ships. And sailing ships were moving from Europe to the New World, bringing cargo, bringing horses, bringing whatever they needed in the New World to establish colonies. And so he says, when the still sea conspires in armor, and her sullen and aborted currents breed tiny monsters, true saline is dead. An awkward instant, and the first animal is jettisoned, legs furiously pumping their stiff green gallop, and heads bob up, poise, delicate, pause, consent, in mute nostril agony, carefully refined and sealed over. It's about throwing the horses overboard because the ships were not moving.
Right.
And yet, this was a 14-year-old who wrote this poem. To me,
it's breathtaking.
yes.
That I was playing marbles when I was 14. There's no way that I was in that mindset.
These words in here, her sullen and aborted currents breed tiny monsters. It takes a while to kind of absorb that. And
14.
Yeah, 14 years old.
Yeah.
So he was a poet from a young age. And when they lived in Oakland, when his family lived in Oakland, they moved around a lot because his father was naval.
Military.
He would go to San Francisco, take the bus to San Francisco so he could visit the bookstores where the beat writers hung out.
Right.
And later on in life, he got to be friends with some of those beat writers. Michael McClure, for instance. And so he was headed in that direction before he became a rock star.
So this just take a second, because maybe you've answered it. But when it came to all this material, and I think you did answer it. I was going to say, how do you marshal it? But I guess it's piece by piece. In other words, you can't be overwhelmed by the totality. You say, look at this, oh, here's an iteration, I'm picking this one, and then move on.
Well, it's not so easy to say, I'm picking this one. It takes days sometimes of reading it and comparing them and thinking about it. Yes, but that's essentially the way it worked. And so, I put this together in chronological order because I couldn't think of another order to put it together. And so, so we have the early poems, the ones we did when he was 7 years old, to the ones, I think this one he did when he was 9. To the 14-year-old and so on and so forth. That's the chronological order I could establish based on some of his published work, because as I said before, he left 30 notebooks, but he didn't, for some reason, he was
not dated.
Not date-oriented.
Yeah. There's so many things I read in one of your books about that he would, we're a little off topic here, but I think it's so interesting. He would go to a restaurant and order several meals just to try a little bit of each thing.
Yeah, and to share them with his friends. So it was like people sit down and all share the same meal that's brought out, and no one has the hamburger and no one has the fish sticks. You know, everybody gets a little bit of everything.
Everybody gets everything. The other thing I wanted to bring up before we run out of time, you lived in Italy.
Yes.
And then you fairly recently visited again, I think. Is that right?
Several years ago.
Okay. But after you lived there.
Yes.
When you went back, were you asked to speak at a Jim Morrison kind of event?
Well, I was asked to speak a couple of times at literary festivals. There's a great appreciation for Jim and his poetry, and a lot of American writers and their poetry or their books in Europe, much more so than here. And I became sort of a spokesperson for Jim's work. Okay. And fortunately and gratefully, I've been invited several times. And I think I'm going again this summer to a literary festival because this book has been published by Rizzoli, one of the big Italian publishers. Oh. And so I'll go and speak about the book to an Italian audience this summer. This was, I'm sorry, HarperCollins? HarperCollins, yeah.
Okay. You also did something for Time Warner, I believe.
For Warner Books.
Warner, okay.
Yeah.
But then you redid that on your own, I think, because they edited some things out that you felt should be in there. Is that accurate? I thought you came out with another version with some of the same material but more inclusive.
So that's entirely true, Steve, and thank you for bringing that up. In fact, I was the one who edited the Warner version of the book because they wanted essentially a book of photographs of rock groups and the Doors. And so I was able to give them that and then give them portions of these interviews I had done with Jim's friends. I'm a sort of a documentarian. I do documentary films, documentary photographs, and documentary audio pieces. And so I went out and interviewed Jim's friends with a tape recorder, and came back and transcribed those interviews and put them out just a few years ago as a book with the interviews entire, not cut up.
Right.
And that book, Friends Gathered Together, it's called, is available to anybody who wants to look at Jim from the point of view of his friends on Amazon.
So I read that, and the thing that struck me is, because they're transcribed, you can really hear the individual voices. They sound like themselves, and they come at this from different perspectives. But in the end, all are complimentary of Jim. That was the take that I got. They looked at different aspects, maybe some wackiness, but there's nobody who didn't like him.
So this book the interviews were inspired by a movie called The Doors, which many people have seen, which was not complimentary about Jim, and made a fool of him, we thought, his friends thought. So I thought, let me go out and interview these people. They were friends of mine as well as friends of Jim's. So I wrote a list of questions, and I asked them similar questions each one, and to find out stuff like, was Jim a violent person? Because in the movie, the Oliver Stone movie, The Doors, he's portrayed as being violent in certain scenes. And they all agreed that he wasn't violent, that he was a sweet, nice person. He was an alcoholic, got drunk at night, every night. And but we see that now as a medical problem, not so much as or a psychological problem, not so much of a will problem. So yes, those people all confirmed that this guy was not the person he was portrayed to be.
No.
Not in the media, and definitely not in the Oliver Stone movie.
Right. I wonder if, having known people who have focus and really extraordinary talent, but those faults, if there isn't some kind of a equation that when you are so talented here, there must be something that you give up. And I wonder if that, maybe the control, the control not to be an alcoholic. I don't know if they go together or not.
It would be interesting to find out, to learn more about what drives an artist, whether it's Jackson Pollock or whether it's Jim Morrison, what drives them, what early experiences in their life of which they might have hangover anxiety, hangover dread, hangover stress that drives them to make works of art, and then how they relieve that anxiety and stress. I mean, some people meditate, some people drink alcohol, some people walk for 7 weeks.
They do. I guess they do. We're going to run out of time, but I have to tell you, I'm a little bit starstruck with you. Well, some of the things you've told me, you were in the studio when they recorded LA Woman.
Yeah.
What was that like? That must have been something.
All I can tell you is that I was asked to come to the studio to make photographs. And so when I'm making photographs, I'm in my own world.
Right.
And the viewfinder is my entire world.
Right.
And I walk around trying to find the right angles, look at the lighting. I don't know if I heard any of the songs that were, if you asked me what song they did under a certain time, I wouldn't know.
Right.
I mean, it was after the album came out that I finally listened to the songs.
Sure.
So
I've heard that of combat photographers, that it's like they're in their safe zone and it's only a camera, but they're in their own world.
I'm definitely in my own world when I'm taking pictures. I just recently did some photographs for Judy's family, and Judy's my partner, and it was at a winery, and I was there present, but I wasn't there present.
Right.
So I was there with the cameras and taking photographs and doing the thing I do. I suspect a ballet dancer on stage doesn't really know anything about the audience. They're in the moment.
And they have to be.
And they have to be. And I feel I have to be. And when I'm distracted, then I'm not making good photographs.
Yeah. We're out of time. I'll catch you. Let's go out for coffee.
Okay.
We'll do that. Folks, that's it. Again, this is just such a terrific guest and a good friend. I'll see you next time on The Writing Life. What do you think? We done?
I don't know. You guys want to do one just with yourself without me doing the
we're done. If they got enough. They got enough.
They got enough? Probably. Okay, sounds good.
Let's go ahead.